Over the last few years, there have been a lot of CRP acres that have started to go back into crop production. Now, before we talk about this ground coming out of CRP and how to raise a great crop there, let me just first comment on, there are a lot of non-farmers who say, oh, you farmers are taking all this new ground and putting it into production. I'm like, no, we're not even back to ground zero yet. We took a whole bunch of ground out of production about 30 years ago, and we've still got 30 million acres roughly of CRP left in this country. That ground was all farmed at one point.
Well, and there's a difference too, Brian. There's some ground that, in my opinion, probably should stay in CRP. It's ground that's highly erodible or it's just
next
not,
to a river or something like that.
It's just something that really isn't productive farm ground 9 years out of 10. Then again, there's some ground that's highly productive ground that for whatever reason somebody said, you know, the payment's pretty good from the government
right.
on the CRP.
Came down to dollars and cents.
I'm just going to take the cash. And, you know, on some of that ground, hey, it would be a lot better use for really for everybody if it came back into production and raised some food.
Okay, the most important thing we want to stress with this ground that was in CRP is you've had, who knows, 10, 15, maybe 30 years where you've been, in effect, building this ground up. The organic matter levels have been going up. You've maintained your soil in there. You've built topsoil. That's all good stuff. So we just don't want to see it go back to where it was before, lowering organic matter, losing topsoil, that type of thing. So we strongly encourage you, don't do a lot of tillage when you're starting to put crop into that CRP ground. Now I realize you might have to do some tillage to level off some of the mounds that might have been created there, fill in some of the badger holes and that kind of thing. But try to avoid full-scale tillage there if you can.
Well, you've got an opportunity here because, frankly, you know, for most of this ground, it's not going to go out of production again for another 20 or 30 years. So you have to make important decisions now. The other thing is burning off residue. I really don't like to see residue burned off unless it's an absolute last resort. Because again, you've got all this organic matter you've built up, and now you've got this organic material on top of the ground that will eventually become organic matter, and it serves such a valuable purpose in terms of preventing erosion and soil loss. I think it'd be great if you could keep it and somehow manage it with that residue out there.
Yeah, and just understand, when you burn residue, you've now lost most of the nitrogen that was in that residue, you've lost a bunch of the potassium and the phosphorus and some of the other nutrients, so you don't want to burn residue unless you absolutely have to. Well anyway, perhaps the biggest question we get with this ground coming out of CRP is, what crop should I plant in there first? So it depends kind of on what your CRP mix was. If it was mostly grass, then I would try to raise a broadleaf crop, something like soybeans for example, where I can control grasses very easily.
Well, Roundup Ready soybeans would be a better answer, Brian, because now you have that option that I've got Roundup there because some of those grasses that you've got out there are going to be pretty tough to kill because they're perennial grasses. Yeah. And Roundup is really the best thing because it's going to get down into the roots and kill all those growing points. The other side of that is if you want to have better grass control on those perennial grasses, don't do tillage. Once you chop up that root system, those perennials have rhizomes and they're going to shoot up new sprouts with every little chunk of root that you just cut off. So leave the roots intact, spray the Roundup first, make sure you get that Roundup at a strong rate down through the whole root system.
If you're going to raise soybeans, obviously you haven't raised soybeans on this ground for quite a number of years, so chances are you don't have a lot of rhizobia bacteria that are in the soil. So what we would suggest you do, because keep in mind rhizobia bacteria pull nitrogen out of the air and turn it into a form your plant can use. What we want you to do is double inoculate. I'd probably use a liquid inoculant as well as a dry inoculant, and then I would also put on some nitrogen on this ground, maybe 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen and potentially even more than that. Soybeans need lots of nitrogen if you're going to raise a great crop.
Well, the other thing is just to do some good soil sampling, Brian. You talk about putting on a little nitrogen, and that's a no-brainer. You've got a lot of residue out there that's high in carbon and low in nitrogen if you've been growing grasses in your CRP. So to break that down and have the natural process work in your fields, you have to get that carbon to nitrogen ratio down to 12 to 13 parts to 1 part of nitrogen. Now, if you get enough nitrogen added, you can do that and break that residue down, make those nutrients useful for your crop. But the other nutrients out in your field, you know, you've got to look and see what you've got. I don't know what you have in your field and what kind of fertility levels there are. You probably haven't been applying extra fertilizer out there, but again, you've been raising successful perennial crops in your field, and that residue's been breaking down and returning nutrients to the soil. So you may need a whole bunch of nutrition, you may not need that much. Take some good soil samples out in those fields to know for sure.
Whether you're raising soybeans or any other crop, we want you to fertilize this ground that is going to come out of CRP. Now let's talk about corn just a little bit. The biggest concern I have if you're going to raise corn is nitrogen tie-up. You apply a bunch of nitrogen and like Darren said, it's going to get tied up. So what I always encourage farmers to do when they're raising corn on corn is use at least an extra 50 pounds of nitrogen beyond what you would in a corn-soybean rotation. But if you're corn into CRP ground, you probably need an extra 100 pounds or more nitrogen above and beyond what you would normally do in a corn-soybean rotation. When you have ground coming out of CRP, we just strongly encourage you, try to avoid tillage as much as you possibly can. Do what you can to raise a good crop this next year by fertilizing, but first you have to soil test to find out what nutrients you're going to need. And don't forget about putting nitrogen out whether you're raising soybeans or corn or anything, because we're going to have nitrogen tie-up in CRP ground.
Well, and who knows what kind of weeds you're going to have out there too, Brian. Maybe it's our weed of the week. We'll show you how to control this tough weed coming up next.